Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're listening to this. This is Comic Cuts for the 15th of May 2020, mid-pandemic. My name's Steve. I haven't really got anything planned to talk about, although we do have a Q&A, which I've managed to rescue. We had a similar problem this week as we had last week, which is that the video wouldn't save properly. Every time I tried to save it, the computer went a bit doolally and eventually shut down and rebooted. Now, this is quite worrying, but I do at least this week know why. It's called a video TDR failure. TDR standing for Timeout Detection and Recovery. And what's happening is that the graphics display driver stops responding. It's overwhelmed by the complexity of the video. And to resolve that problem, Windows reboots the computer. Now, I've tried to solve this in various ways, saving the video in various formats, and even just compiling small parts of the video and trying to save that. Unfortunately, I just can't get it to work. Now, the video itself, I can see it on the editing equipment, and I can play it on the editing equipment. So what I've done is I've used my tablet, which is what you're watching now, and I've filmed the screen on my computer so that you can actually see what I was trying to do. The sound quality was not very good, so hopefully I've replaced the sound with the original audio track that I was using, and that they will save together. Fingers crossed. I have no idea, as I'm speaking these words, whether that will work or not. So I'm now going to throw to myself talking about Eric Dadswell, who's an artist that I was quite interested in. And then we'll come back for a little bit more news and a little bit more chat. Okay, I'll see you in a minute. Okay, we have a Q&A, slightly different format this week because although this is in answer to a question, I've kind of broadened it out a little bit to take a look at an artist. The initial question was, who is the artist of Thunderbolt the Avenger, which was a superhero strip that ran in Buster in the mid-1960s. The artist was Eric Dadswell. And I must admit that I know very little about Dadswell, so I think it's worth putting on record what I do know and seeing if anybody else can help expand our knowledge of his work, of his career, and perhaps even tell us something about the artist himself. As far as I'm aware, the earliest strip that Dadswell drew was for Eagle Annual number 2 back in 1952, and it was a feature called The March of TV. It's just a 4-page little feature on the history of television and how programs are made. But his first major work would appear to be the Fleet Family in the early issues of Swift. So the most notable thing about the Fleet Family was that it was taken over by Frank Bellamy after a number of weeks. But it was originated by Eric Dadswell and told the story of a family who were flying to Australia, but their plane is hit by a water spout and brought down. I think I described it once as mildly diverting adventure, which is really all it is. But apparently Eric Dadswell left the strip to put together a comic strip based on the Grove family, which is a famous as being one of the very first, if not the first, soap operas. Apparently, he was offered the job because Ruth Dunning, who was one of the lead actresses on the Grove family, was the sister of Jessica Dunning, wife of Marcus Morris, who was the editor of Eagle and who had been involved in the creation of Girl and Swift. And apparently it was Dadswell's work on Swift that earned him this opportunity to draw the Grove family. Now, quite when and where the strip ran, I don't know. It may have run in somewhere like TV Mirror, but I've no way of confirming that. What I do know is that Dadswell was drawing features for Eagle in 1956 and was also contributing to Girl Annual from that year. He did two particularly good strips for Girl Annual in the early years. The first was a history of the Bronte sisters and Bronte brother, which appeared in the fifth Girl Annual, and also the story of Fanny Kemble, who was an anti-slavery campaigner whose journals were very influential in changing people's sentiment towards slavery. That appeared in the sixth Girl Annual in 1957. Dadswell was quite a prolific illustrator for Girl, having appeared in Volume 1 with an illustration for a short story. He then did a number of serials in the mid-1950s, so 1956-1957 period, including stories by Pat Smythe and Judith Beresford. So he continued drawing those illustrations for Girl through the late 1950s, and at the same time was also drawing comic strips for Valentine. He then took over drawing Smiley for the front cover of Swift in 1959-1960, but then there's something of a gap. He may have been drawing elsewhere in places that haven't been indexed yet. I know he continued to draw the odd feature and strip for Eagle Annual, and in fact that's where we next find some work by him. It's the two Man of Battle strips in Eagle Annual for 1965. Dadswell then turns up in Valiant with a strip called 12 Guilty Men, before switching to Buster to draw Thunderbolt, which he then continues for some years. And Thunderbolt spans the period when he's not drawing for Valiant, because almost as soon as he finishes drawing Thunderbolt, he's back in Valiant drawing Sexton Blake. Now, the Sexton Blake stories ran from January 1968 through to May 1970. A number of them were based on old Maxwell Hawke stories from Buster. And I think the early ones were adapted by a guy called Harold Lamb. But I know Angus Allen also scripted some of the material for Sexton Blake. Drawing Sexton Blake up to 1970, Dadswell then seems to have become relegated to working for annuals. And I know he had work in the Eagle Annual and the Lion Annual, Hurricane Annual, Thunder Annual, Tiger Annual even, during the early 1970s, but doesn't appear to have had a regular weekly strip. I may be doing him a disservice. Certainly in the 1970s, he was also drawing for D.C. Thompson, although I know of only one strip about a character called Danny Boyd that appeared in Hotspur. At that point, which is 1974, Dadswell seems to disappear entirely, and I have absolutely no idea what became of him, whether he continued working for Thompson's, whether he switched to working elsewhere. Perhaps he was working for Nursery Comics, perhaps he's in romance comics. I must admit I don't know, and I'm hoping that somebody will be able to help out here. I mean, where did Dadswell's work appear in the 1970s, and what was his last strip? He may have been appearing in girls' comics, he may have been appearing in other D.C. Thompson romance titles, like Star Love and places like that, which I must admit I've got very little information about. So it would be interesting to find out what Dadswell's last work was. As I say, the last work that I can trace dates from 1974, and one wonders whether he may have retired or died around that period. He was certainly an interesting artist, and I'd love to know more about him. And I'm hoping that perhaps by letting you know what I know and the limits of what I know, somebody may be able to step in and fill some of the gaps. Please feel free to contact me. Drop me a line. My email is to be found at the Bear Alley website, or you can leave comments on my Facebook page or indeed on this YouTube video. All right, thanks.
Well, hopefully that didn't give you too much of a headache. I also apologise for the lack of light on the earlier video. I'm rather at the whim of the weather. This office is a converted garage, so it's lit from one side, but if a cloud scuds over the sun, it can suddenly plunge into darkness. And I did attempt to do a little bit of tweaking of the earlier video, but it was still very dark and grainy. Hopefully this one will be slightly better. A little bit of news. I'm about 25% there with the relettering, so about halfway through the first volume. It does take time. It's a slow process, so it will be some weeks before before we're finished. And I do allow myself to be distracted by various things, like the research that it took to do this Eric Dadswell piece, and also the research I've been doing to write the introduction and to come up with some information about the various artists on this particular project. So, you know, the time isn't going to waste. I think that's about all the news I have. I did make some shortbread on Monday, which was very nice. And I do thoroughly recommend doing something like that. It tests you in different ways. I've discovered that I can follow instructions quite well. And at the end of the day, you've got some tasty treats, which is a win-win situation as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. Hopefully next week I'll have some actual news, although I absolutely can't promise. But I'll also attempt to do a Q&A, or try and think of a new way of doing the Q&As that doesn't kill my computer. So let me think about that. Until then, stay safe, and I will talk to you again next week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.